Alright, we've got a pretty dramatic one to talk about today. On the morning of March 4th, a Piper Cherokee, registration November 7744, Tango crashed into a residential neighborhood near Deer Valley Airport in Phoenix, Arizona, coming down about 2 miles east of the field after an in-flight problem developed. There were 2 people on board, a student pilot and a flight instructor, and remarkably, both survived. The airplane clipped a house and ended up in a backyard, with debris scattered across multiple homes. One resident inside one of those houses was also injured, bringing the total number of injuries to 3. What really caught my attention though was the way the airplane came down at the very end. Instead of settling into a controlled glide, it pitched down sharply just before impact. That raises a few questions. Was this a forced landing after a power problem? Did the airplane get too slow while maneuvering close to the ground? Or was the engine doing something more complicated than a simple failure? The investigation is still early, but we already have enough to start putting the picture together. And the key point here may be that the engine didn't quit completely, and that may have made this situation harder, not easier. My name is William and you're watching Black Box Analyst. Let's check it out. The aircraft involved here was a Piper PA-28-140 Cherokee, a very familiar airplane to most pilots in the United States. This particular one was built in 1968, and aircraft like it are still widely used in flight schools today. It's a fairly simple design: fixed landing gear, a fixed pitch propeller, and a carbureted Lycoming engine, producing about 140 horsepower. In cruise, a Cherokee like this typically flies somewhere around 105 to 110 knots. It's a straightforward training airplane, but like most aircraft in this class, its glide performance is fairly limited. The important detail in this accident is that the flight appears to have been a training flight. That means the cockpit likely had a student pilot in one seat and a certified flight instructor in the other. That dynamic can matter when something unexpected happens. In a training environment, both pilots may initially be working the problem, checking instruments, discussing what the airplane is doing, and deciding who should be flying. At the same time, there's always the possibility that the student is the one at the controls when the problem first appears, which can introduce a short delay while the instructor decides whether to take over or coach the student through the situation. According to early reports, the airplane departed Deer Valley Airport and climbed eastbound. The initial portion of the flight appears to have been normal, but about 4 miles east of the airport, the crew began experiencing engine trouble. Specifically, the pilot later reported that the engine RPM had dropped. That's a key detail because it suggests the engine probably didn't fail completely. Instead, the airplane was dealing with reduced power. At that point, the aircraft turned around and began descending back toward Deer Valley Airport. And that decision, trying to make it back to the runway, can sometimes set up a difficult situation for the crew, depending on how much performance the airplane actually has left. Now let's talk about the video, because the final seconds of this flight give us an important clue about how the accident likely unfolded. The footage shows the airplane descending toward a residential area just outside the airport, but the motion doesn't look like a stabilized glide toward a landing site. Instead, just before impact, the airplane suddenly drops nose down rather abruptly. That kind of movement is something pilots tend to recognize pretty quickly. It often appears when an airplane exceeds its critical angle of attack. In simple terms, the aircraft has slowed to the point where the wings can no longer produce enough lift. When that happens, airflow separates from the wing and the airplane stalls. In training environments, pilots practice stall recoveries regularly. The basic idea is straightforward: reduce the angle of attack, allow the airplane to accelerate, and then return to controlled flight. But that recovery assumes one important thing: altitude. If the stall happens high above the ground, there's usually plenty of room to recover. When it happens just a few hundred feet above the ground, that margin disappears very quickly. And that's what makes stalls during low altitude maneuvering particularly dangerous. In the video from this accident, that abrupt nose-down motion strongly suggests the airplane may have stalled during the final moments of the forced landing attempt. To understand how the airplane ended up in that situation, we need to step back and look at what was happening in the minutes leading up to the crash. Radio transmissions captured during the event give us a fairly clear picture of how the situation developed in the cockpit.
Cherokee 44 Tango, we're going to come back in. We're having some engine trouble.
Cherokee 44 Tango, runway 25 right, clear to land, say nature of emergency.
We lost engine RPMs. It's not really emergency, but we can't make it back to the field.
At some point after the power loss began, the pilot contacted Deer Valley Tower and reported that they were having engine trouble and reduced RPM. Air traffic control responded by clearing the airplane to land and asking about the nature of the situation. Interestingly, the pilot indicated that it wasn't necessarily an emergency, even though the aircraft had already turned back toward the airport. Operationally, that detail is less important than the bigger issue that was developing. The airplane's performance was no longer matching the plan. Now, if we look at the numbers, the geometry of the situation starts to become clearer. ADS-B data shows the aircraft at roughly 3,200 feet MSL, which places it about 1,600 feet above the ground in that area. At the same time, the airplane was still around 4 miles away from the airport. That combination matters. Even in a best-case glide scenario, a Cherokee at that altitude would struggle to reach the runway from that distance. The descent rate recorded in the data was around 800 feet per minute. That suggests the engine was still producing some power, just not enough to maintain altitude. And that's really the deceptive part here. The airplane was giving them just enough performance to keep the runway in mind, but not enough performance to actually get them there. The flight data also shows small variations in climb and descent along the return path. That pattern can sometimes indicate intermittent changes in engine output. Investigators will eventually look closely at possible causes for that kind of behavior, including fuel delivery issues, mixture settings, or carburetor-related problems. Even though carburetor icing is less common in Arizona's dry climate, it's still something investigators typically examine when an engine isn't producing steady power. But regardless of the exact mechanical cause, the situation created a difficult decision-making environment. The airplane still had some thrust, which may have made the runway seem just barely reachable. And once the runway remains in the pilot's mind as an option, it's natural to keep trying to get there. The problem is that every second spent aiming for the runway also means losing altitude and losing potential landing options along the way. By the time the airplane reached the residential area east of the airport, those options had become very limited. As the aircraft descended toward the neighborhood east of the airport, the number of available landing options began shrinking. Earlier in the descent, there may have been opportunities to attempt a forced landing on open terrain, undeveloped ground, or possibly a roadway. None of those options are ideal, but committing early to a landing site gives the pilot more control over how the airplane arrives there. Continuing toward the airport changes that equation. Every second spent flying closer to the runway is also a second spent losing altitude, which removes potential landing sites behind you. By the time the aircraft reached the residential area, the environment had become much more restrictive. At that point, this had basically turned into a geometry problem. The airplane was low, the neighborhood was tight, and with every passing second, there was one less place left to put it down. The airplane eventually lined up with a narrow residential street, East Parkside Lane. Like many suburban streets, it's surrounded by obstacles, power lines, trees, parked vehicles, and closely spaced houses. Trying to guide an airplane through that kind of space at low altitude leaves very little margin for error. When pilots see obstacles approaching during a forced landing, the natural instinct is to pull back on the controls in an attempt to clear them. If the airplane is already slow, even a small increase in angle of attack can be enough to trigger a stall. Evidence from the crash site suggests something along those lines may have happened here. During the final moments of the descent, the right wing struck the roof of a house, the wing separated from the aircraft, and the fuselage rotated before coming to rest in a backyard. Photographs from the scene show the tail section bent forward over the fuselage, a deformation sometimes seen in high-angle impacts. Given the altitude involved and the obstacles in the area, the outcome of this accident was remarkably survivable. The airplane struck structures rather than impacting the ground directly, which may have absorbed some of the crash energy. Both occupants survived the impact, and although a resident in the neighborhood was injured, the situation could easily have been far worse. At this point, investigators will be focused on two main questions: what reduced the engine's performance, and how the final decisions unfolded once the airplane could no longer make the runway. That means looking closely at the engine, the fuel and carburetor systems, the ADS-B data, and the ATC communications to see how the mechanical side and the human side came together. Right now, we still don't have final answers. But based on what's available so far, this accident shows exactly why low altitude power loss events deserve so much respect. Things can still look salvageable right up until they're not, and by the time that becomes obvious, you may already be out of room. Hopefully this one gives you something useful to think about. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and see you in the next video.